All right, so are you ready to dive into something kind of controversial today?
Always up for a good debate. What do we have?
Well, we're looking at this article, and it's called, get this, the premier source for propaganda.
Ooh, that's a bold statement right off the bat.
It is, and the subtitle goes on to say, how disability scoop exemplifies neocolonial, neoliberal, and NTAA add a subtitle. You know, it gets a little wordy.
Yeah, I'm seeing that. But Disability Scoop, that's a website, right?
Exactly. It's like the go-to news source for a lot of folks in the disability community.
So this article is saying they're pushing propaganda.
That's what they're claiming, and they're using some pretty academic language to do it.
That's what we're here for, to break it down and see if it holds water.
Right. So their main argument is that Disability Scoop is like subtly pushing a far-right agenda.
Interesting. How so?
Well, they point to a specific article, Disability Scoop, published about President Trump's plan to dismantle the U.S. Department of Education.
Ah, okay, that's a hot button issue for sure.
Big time. And this article claims that Disability Scoop kind of downplayed the potential negative consequences.
They didn't really, explore the downsides.
Not really. It was more like, oh, this is just a simple administrative change.
Interesting, because obviously for people with disabilities, the Department of Education plays a huge role in ensuring equal access and protection.
Huge. So to just brush it off as no big deal seems kind of suspicious, right?
Yeah, I can see why this other article is raising red flags. But I mean, Disability Scoop covers all sorts of disability news, right?
They do. Everything from like new accessibility tech to legislation to personal stories.
So how do we reconcile that with this idea of them pushing a far-right agenda? Is every article suspect?
That's a good question. And to be fair, the article does acknowledge that Disability Scoop publishes a wide range of content.
Okay, so what's their point then?
They're arguing that the far-right agenda isn't always about, like, overt endorsements. It can be woven into seemingly neutral reporting.
Through things like what? Framing? Word choice.
Exactly. And even which stories get prioritized, which ones get buried. It's subtle.
So it's not necessarily about Disability Scoop coming on saying, vote for this candidate.
Right. It's more about nudging readers toward a certain way of thinking.
Okay, I'm starting to get it. But let's get specific. What exactly is this far-right agenda they're talking about?
Well, the article digs into three main ideologies: neocolonialism, neoliberalism, and neoconservatism.
Oh boy, those are some big words.
I know, but they actually make sense in this context. The article breaks them down pretty well.
All right, I'm ready. Hit me with it.
Okay, so first up, neocolonialism. This one's about exploiting marginalized groups for profit while maintaining a facade of equity.
So, pretending to help while actually taking advantage.
Exactly. They actually use Disability Scope as an example of this.
Whoa, hold on. How is covering disability news neocolonialism?
Well, they're saying that if Disability Scoop is, like, shaping the narrative in a way that benefits certain groups.
Groups who are maybe profiting off, privatized education or something?
Right. They could be seen as furthering that agenda.
That is pretty insidious.
And then there's neoliberalism. That one's all about market-based solutions and deregulation, often at the expense of public goods.
So basically, the government steps back and lets the free market sort everything out, even if that means some people get left behind.
Yeah, pretty much. And finally, we have neoconservatism. This one's about reinforcing traditional values and hierarchies.
Okay, so how do all three of these connect back to Disability Scoop and the Department of Education?
Well, they're saying that by downplaying the potential harm of dismantling the Department of Education.
Disability Scoop is essentially pushing a neoliberal agenda of shrinking government.
Right. And by not really addressing the potential impact on vulnerable students in different states.
They're kind of supporting this idea of neocolonialism, where some groups benefit at the expense of others.
Exactly. And they even connect all of this to Argentina.
Argentina. What does Argentina have to do with this?
They use Argentina as an example of what can happen when these far-right policies are implemented.
Oh, I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
They say that Argentina, under neoliberal governance, saw record poverty, soaring unemployment, cuts to public services.
So basically a disaster for the average person.
Pretty much. And they're drawing a parallel to what could happen in the U.S. if we dismantle the Department of Education.
Because it would shift responsibility to the states. And some states might prioritize disability rights, but others, not so much.
Exactly. And that creates a system where, your zip code determines your rights.
Yikes. So this states' rights argument that some people are pushing.
It sounds good on the surface, right? More local control, less federal overreach.
Yeah, but I'm sensing a but coming.
Oh, there's a huge but. The article points out that states' rights has often been used to justify, like, really harmful policies.
Do you give me an example?
They mention things like restricting access to health care, making it harder to vote, even rolling back environmental protections.
Wow. Okay, so it's not as simple as it seems.
Not at all. And they're saying that Disability Scoop, by supporting this states' rights rhetoric,
Is potentially contributing to this system where marginalized communities get hurt.
exactly. So to sum all this up, we have Disability Scoop, a website a lot of people trust for information about disability issues.
But this article is claiming that they're subtly pushing a far-right agenda through their reporting.
And they're doing this through things like framing, word choice, prioritizing certain stories over others.
And by supporting ideas like states' rights that sound good on paper but can have really negative consequences in reality.
It's a lot to take in, right?
It is. And this Argentina connection is blowing my mind. I had no idea.
Right. It's like a warning sign for what could happen here. And it makes you think, if we can't even trust a source that's supposed to be dedicated to disability issues, who can we trust?
Big question. And one we're going to keep exploring in part 2, so make sure to tune in for that.
Yeah.
So, we were talking about Disability Scoop, maybe pushing a certain agenda, but, like, who's actually in charge there? Who's deciding what gets published?
Yeah. The article kind of hints at this idea that there's a disconnect between, like, the people making editorial decisions and the actual lived experiences of disabled folks.
Interesting. What do you mean?
Well, they point out that it's often parents, siblings, caregivers, those kinds of folks who are driving the narrative in disability-focused media.
Oh, instead of disabled people themselves.
Yeah. And I get it to some extent. Like, those are the people who are often, interacting with the systems, fighting for services, dealing with all the red tape.
Right, they're on the front lines for sure.
Totally. But the article's point is that this can lead to a certain perspective,
Like maybe their experiences, while valid, aren't the only ones that matter.
Exactly. It's not that those voices shouldn't be heard, but they shouldn't be the only ones we're hearing.
Right. And this is where the article's call for centering disabled voices becomes so important.
It's about recognizing that disabled people are the experts on their own lives, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And it ties back to this whole media bias thing. When you have a limited range of voices being represented.
It's easier for certain agendas to slip in.
Exactly. And to make things even more complex, we have to think about, like, the algorithms and media platforms themselves.
Ugh, the algorithms. Don't even get me started.
But seriously, they play a role here, right? The article talks about how social media algorithms prioritize content that's, what's the word? Sensationalized. Emotionally charged.
Oh, totally. And it's like a parent fighting for their child's rights, a sibling struggling to cope. Those stories, they tend to pull at the heartstrings,
Yeah, those narratives get clicks.
But that doesn't mean they're the most important stories or that they represent the whole disability community.
It's just that they fit what those algorithms are looking for.
Exactly. And then at the same time, you have, like, genuinely marginalized journalists and creators facing all these barriers.
Really demonetization.
Yeah.
Censorship.
Totally. So it's like a double whammy where algorithms are boosting certain types of stories.
And making it harder for marginalized voices to be heard.
Oh, it's a mess.
And it's especially concerning when you consider how much we rely on these platforms for information these days.
Especially during times of, like, political change or uncertainty. Like right now.
Because when people are scared or anxious, they're more likely to, like, latch on to easy answers.
Even if those answers aren't, accurate or helpful.
Exactly. So, yeah, media literacy is more important than ever. We can't just passively consume information. We need to be critical thinkers.
We need to be asking questions like, who wrote this? Who's funding it? What perspectives are missing?
It sounds like a lot of work.
It is, but the article does offer some tips.
Oh, good. Like what?
Like checking the About Us section of websites, looking at reporters' credentials, researching funding sources.
So like being an internet detective.
Exactly, following those digital breadcrumbs.
One thing that really blew my mind in the article was this whole thing about large language models.
LLMs. Oh, yeah, AI, right.
Yeah. They're saying that some of these reporters are actually just AI creations.
Wait, so AI is writing news articles now?
Apparently. And they're even, like, creating fake reporters to make it seem more legit.
Wow, that is unsettling, to say the least.
It really raises questions about, like, accountability and transparency in journalism.
And it makes this whole thing about supporting real human-driven sources even more important.
For sure. We need to be seeking out those authentic voices from within the disability community.
Voices that are grounded in lived experience.
And, the article does mention platforms like The Outside as a good example of this.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of them. They prioritize firsthand accounts, right?
Yeah, and they offer those alternative viewpoints that we were talking about earlier.
Awesome. Definitely adding them to my reading list.
It's all about shifting that power dynamic,
Making sure that disabled people have control over their own narratives.
That's the key to achieving true equity and justice.
I totally agree. And we can all play a part in that.
By being critical thinkers, seeking out diverse sources, amplifying those marginalized voices.
Exactly. This has been a really eye-opening conversation.
It has. And I think our listeners are probably feeling the same way.
So for everyone listening, don't get overwhelmed. In part 3, we're going to talk about some concrete steps we can take to, actually address these issues.
Okay, so we've really dug deep into this whole media bias thing, right?
Right.
Kind of makes you want to swear off the internet forever, huh?
I know, right? It can be pretty discouraging. Is any information actually trustworthy anymore?
Seriously.
Yeah.
But the thing is, ignoring the problem doesn't make it go away.
True. So what can we do besides, throw our phones into the ocean?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to remember that knowledge is power.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. Now that we're aware of these issues, we can start to, be more mindful, more intentional.
So being aware of those biases is the first step.
Exactly. And then, we talked about all that internet detective stuff, right? Checking sources, researching funding, that kind of thing.
Right, so we can't just take things at face value.
Definitely not. And even beyond that, we can be more critical of the actual content we're consuming. How is this information being presented? What's the angle here?
So it's not just about avoiding, obviously biased sources, but about learning to recognize those subtle tricks.
Yeah, building up those media literacy muscles. And the cool thing is, that's something anyone can do.
There are tons of resources out there, right? Like websites, books, even classes.
Totally. And it's once you start paying attention to these things, you start seeing them everywhere.
It's like a whole new world opens up, and not always a pretty one.
True. But, we can use this knowledge to help others too, right?
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
We can talk to our friends or families, share resources online.
We can advocate for more responsible reporting in our communities. Write letters to the editor, call out biased coverage when we see it.
And we can support those organizations that are already doing good work, the ones that are centering marginalized voices,
Right.
promoting ethical journalism.
Yeah. Subscribe to independent media, donate to nonprofits.
And even just sharing their content, recommending them to others, that makes a difference too.
Totally. It's all about shifting the balance, right? Amplifying those voices that are often drowned out by the mainstream.
Exactly. And that brings us back to that key point about centering disabled voices.
It's not enough to just be critical of the media. We have to actively seek out and listen to those who are often excluded from the conversation.
Disabled people are the experts on their own lives.
Exactly. And that means not just listening to them, but creating space for them to lead.
Yeah.
Supporting disabled journalists, artists, activists.
Making sure they have the platforms and the resources to share their stories, to advocate for change.
It's about shifting that power dynamic, from a system where non-disabled people are speaking for disabled people to one where disabled people have the power to speak for themselves.
I love that.
Yeah.
That's such a powerful way to put it.
It's what this whole deep dive has been about, really.
Yeah.
Realizing that we all have a responsibility to, shape the information landscape, be more critical, be more curious, and, keep learning.
Well said. It's been a really thought-provoking conversation.
Definitely. And hopefully, our listeners are feeling inspired to take action. Even if it's just a small step, every little bit helps.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me on. It's been great.
Thanks for joining us. We'll see you next time for another deep dive into, whatever intriguing topic we find ourselves exploring next.